Intersubjectivity as a foundation for man's knowledge, the search for common explanation, and the meta-narrative. What I want to examine in this presentation is phenomenological intersubjectivity, and intersubjectivity as a concept in the foundation of scientific knowledge. Intersubjectivity as a term is interesting because, as a veterinarian trained in evidence-based veterinary medicine, the term is used when a validation of objectivity is sought. In this sense, the subject is actually removed, made transparent by the need to only verify what is seen clearly absent any subjective interference. Gallagher points out that the full implication of this is that the subject is irrelevant to truth. So what does it mean to say something is evidence-based? Is there a difference between what is factual and truthful? As an entry point, I know that the term intersubjectivity is used in experimental science to validate how scientific researchers identify facts about the physical world. But paradoxically, I also know that the term applies in the branch of philosophy called phenomenology, which establishes being in the world. As a starting point to inquiry, intersubjectivity occupies a potentially fruitful intersection to explore between what empirical sciences perhaps profess to aim towards, total objectivity and abdicative subjectivity, and perhaps what full immanence of human being would imply, complete subjectivity and abdicative objectivity. Nuclear fusion is very much at the cutting edge of experimental science. An article on the BBC News website refers to nuclear fusion research that has been taking place in the US at a laboratory over the past decade. That article makes reference to how evidence will be gathered to support the results. Experimental science is founded on the repeatability of observations made in experiments. As a next step, Dr. Callahan said the experiments would be repeated. That's fundamental to experimental science. We need to understand how reproducible and how sensitive the results are to small changes, she said. Intersubjectivity, in the sense of contemporary experimental science, seems to share an impulse to simplify to public observation, which follows a pattern whose logic Carnap articulated. Noteworthy is that Carnap himself wrote that there is no sharp line between observable and non-observable predicates, but for the sake of simplicity, a line is drawn between the two. It is simply a matter of preference to exclude the non-observable. Another way of seeing the same division is between the private and the public. The observable is public, and the non-observable predicate is private. Experimental science, in this view, is no more than a methodological preference of the public predicate. Intersubjectivity, in this sense, though, is not really an ontological declaration, but is a normative statement, a rule that establishes the systemic method to be applied to a particular discipline. So how does this compare with the phenomenologist's view of intersubjectivity? For the phenomenologist, the mental state is immediately observable. Beginning with the self as existent and other selves as existing, the phenomenologist refers to more than only objects existing, but also to other subjects as existing. This is subject to a methodical objection by the positivist empiricist that any mental state is a private predicate and not a public predicate. In the use of intersubjectivity that a positivist scientist makes of the term, the predicate is not observable to others. The method that the phenomenologist uses to establish knowledge is outside the method that the positivist scientist uses. This is not necessarily a problem at any level, because as we have raised, the author of the distinction, Carnap, is explicit. The methodical division is for simplicity rather than of logical necessity. Is it then possible to reconcile the term intersubjectivity with both empirical science and with phenomenological philosophy? In one mode, the answer is no, not if the predicates are defined so as to specifically exclude each other. This always seems to be a choice we have with language. We have the choice what to include or exclude in any definition. By excluding the non-observable elements, the definitions cannot overlap. They refer to different things. As an aside, the impulse to analyze and reduce definitions might be out of concern that too much might be included. Too much referent content must naturally also include greater risk for importation of erroneous content, which might damage the validity of the construct and hence the authority, social standing, of the purveyor of the idea. A lot of the impulse to analytically reduce may therefore be narcissism. The more analytical science becomes, it is more inevitable the further from any unity it will move, because the more accurately a thing is described, the less accurately the nature of that thing is embraced. The impulse towards over-rationality, the ability to give reasons that approximate most closely with facts, the further this kind of truth takes humans further from their starting point in existence. This impulse is understandable, as Gallagher points out, because the question of truth does contain the question of the origin of evidence. I want to submit to what is there, but how comes it that there is anything there? Evidence is the way reality is present to my thought. Knowing is an unconditional desire to explain what is, to be able to say yes to what is reality in itself. This impulse to leave the object of judgment untouched and to abdicate completely before what is affirmed propels the thinker towards a pure transcendental subjectivity. Gallagher, 2018. So is it possible to reconcile the term intersubjectivity as some important and meaningful interlocutor between empirical science and phenomenological philosophy? The answer is yes, in two ways. Firstly, a very simple method and a traditional method is that if analogy is accepted as an essential component of language, then the definition of intersubjectivity can be broadened to permit of other explanations. However, there is also a systemic or common understanding that is, I think, more profound than this linguistic one. Traditional philosophy has a notion of connatural knowledge that would seem to substantiate intersubjectivity. The connatural is whatever is fitting to or in accord with nature, and involves an affinity of the knower to the thing known. Intuitively, it seems fitting and correct that knowledge is completely indivisible, such that knowledge varies according to the nature of the knowing subject. St. Thomas held that we know the acts of our own soul directly. Gallagher points out that the existentialist has grasped this and his justification of knowledge is a continuum with that of traditional philosophy, when viewed as processing from as a being is, so it acts, to as a being is, so it knows. Some people think philosophy begins in wonder, but I think philosophy begins with ambiguities. One of the ambiguities philosophy tackles is the classification of concepts. Some people think the task of epistemology is the rational reconciliation of the concepts of all fields of knowledge on a basis of concepts that are the immediate given. This line of epistemology relies on a prejudicial question. That question is, what are the grounds of experience that found objectivity? In asking that question, the questioner has already questioned too much. This line of philosophy leads to the negation of the subject. If the subject is held to be essentially constitutive to truth, then the negation of the subject is an entirely negative and undesirable outcome, and rethinking of epistemology is common sense. Intersubjective knowledge begins with an insight. That insight is that being is what a man knows first. From this insight, man can know other beings. Knowledge, from this perspective, is the unveiling of being, an unveiling which is contingent on the situational existence of the subject being unveiled. This means that all concepts emerge from a reading back of our experiences rather than as either independent or dependent of our experience. Recognizing this means that a man cannot give a complete or exhaustive account of a concept. This introduces a wellspring aspect to concepts, but does not eliminate the possibility of truth from them, as man remains able to recognize what is compatible with his concepts.